First time I'm doing that. Okay, and then I'll also say that I think when I share my screen, I won't be able, unfortunately, I won't be able to see anyone. So if there are technical difficulties or if anything comes up, please feel free to unmute yourself and let me know, because I won't be able to see the windows. Okay. So does everything look good so far? Can you see one big slide?
I see your screen, so I don't see the present. I see like, there you go. Oh no.
Okay.
You were in
One more
presenter
time.
mode instead of the full screen mode.
Okay. How about now?
There you go.
Okay. Great. Let me move some of my windows around. Okay. So, oh my, all the windows. Okay, well, I will get going. So thank you again to Nick for the invitation to present to everyone today and to share my research and some of the ongoing research that's going on in the Veg Lab at UC Santa Barbara. So I thought I would start with a bit of an introduction, and I'll kind of continue from where we started off just a minute ago. So kind of how I got to be here today with all of you has been through just kind of following these interests through ecology, where when I was at UC Davis, I did my undergrad there and was introduced to ecology and really found it really interesting. And then after graduation, I was introduced to restoration, and I thought, man, like if I could work outside and plant plants and help restore native ecosystems, like this would be amazing if I could make a career out of this. And then from there, I moved to Santa Barbara, where I pursued my graduate school, which is where I met Nick, studying chaparral and fire. And then since then, I've been able to combine all of my interests into my current research, which is in restoration ecology and chaparral. And so right now, my current focus is trying to understand the constraints of chaparral restoration, as well as the drivers of chaparral conversion. And I am one member in the Vegetation Ecology group, or the Veg Lab as we call ourselves. We're led by Dr. Carla D'Antonio, who is my advisor. And then to her right is a picture of Maddie Nolan, who is studying restoration in grasslands, California grasslands. And then to her right is Joanna Tong, who is studying restoration in California vernal pools. And then to her right is Shane DeWeese, who is studying restoration in chaparral. And then along that bottom row is Robert Fitch, who is not necessarily studying restoration directly, but is interested in using native species to revegetate fuel breaks. And then there's also Dr. Jake Schulteis, who she just graduated and finished her PhD a couple of months ago. And her research was focused on manzanitas and the impacts of drought and a pathogen on manzanita survival and mortality. And I have a few additional slides on them and their research at the end of my talk. So kind of getting back to my own research in chaparral, this is kind of what I have in mind, and maybe what you also have in mind when you think of chaparral. However, a lot of my research takes place in landscapes that look like this. So this is a degraded chaparral stand that used to be dominated by chaparral shrubs and is now dominated by non-native annual grasses. And so one question that you might have, and definitely one that I've thought about, is why do we want to restore chaparral? So there's a couple of reasons that I can think of. So one is that it can increase the native species diversity by just having additional shrub species on the landscape. It can help to improve habitat of the animals that live within the chaparral ecosystem. It can help also to protect our endemic and special status species. Chaparral provides a lot of ecosystem services, including education and just inspiration while hiking through chaparral. It's pretty and aesthetically pleasing, and then also it has a lower ignition risk compared to a lot of compared to the non-native annual grass-dominated landscapes that dominate the degraded chaparral landscapes. And so thinking about ignition risk, under a historical fire regime, the ignition risk might be relatively low as the community is recovering following a fire disturbance. However, now with the introduction of non-native annual grasses, our current fire regime looks more like this, that I'm sure you're familiar with, where with the grass-dominated landscapes, we have a much higher risk of ignition due to that increase of dry biomass kind of almost year-round. And so these grass-dominated landscapes then promote more frequent fires, which then promotes more grass spread and more landscapes that are dominated by grass. And so you have this feedback cycle of kind of more frequent fires, spread of grass. And so part of my interest in restoration is that I think restoration can be, one of many solutions that can help reduce the ignition risk on the landscape by restoring some of these grassy areas kind of back to perennial dominated landscapes. So the question then is exactly how do we restore chaparral communities? And luckily, I'm not researching this question alone. I have a number of funders and collaborators that I've worked with, the main one being the U.S. Forest Service. And so the picture in the upper left-hand corner is what my site looks like right now. It, again, used to be dominated with chaparral shrubs. We see some stumps out there, but it's mostly non-native annual grasses. And so my study site that I'm working on is in the southern edge of the Los Padres Forest near Piru, California. And I've been doing research out there since 2016. So one of the approaches that has directed my research has been considering what the constraints to restoring chaparral are. And so there's kind of three main areas that I've been thinking about. The first one is just talking about dispersal of plant material to my site. So are desirable species present at my site? Are the species or seeds getting there either by wind or by seed dispersers, or are we going to have to drive them in a car and bring them to our site? Also, the physical environment. We know that shrubs used to be able to get established out on the site, but we're not really sure about conditions now that it's been grass dominated and that grasses are kind of much more prevalent along the landscape. And so thinking about the physical environment in terms of topography, and then also water availability and maybe sun exposure. And then finally, thinking about the other biotic characters that are present out at our restoration site. So is there competition from non-native species that we need to address? And then also, is there seed predation or herbivory that we need to consider in our restoration plan or restoration goals? So these are the three kind of main topics that I've kind of grouped my research around. So thinking about dispersal, the abiotic environment, and then the biotic environment. And so the first kind of area that I looked at was about seed dispersal. So I looked at both the seed bank to see what species were there already, and then also we looked at bringing in plant material. And so to determine what was already present at our site in the seed bank, we collected soil cores from 0 to 12 centimeters into the ground. We grew these soil cores out in the greenhouse and have pretty much found that there were no desirable shrub species in our soil cores. So we learned that we really probably do need to bring in plant material since there are no desirable shrub species that are already kind of getting to our site. And so the species that we are focusing on or have focused on are white sage, purple sage, chaparral bush mallow, chaparral yucca, and then felt leaf yerba sante. And all of these species are already present at our site. And that's also where we collected the seed. And so we're just trying to see if we can establish them kind of into the site that we're trying to restore. So to bring in plant material, we first sowed seeds. So we sowed seeds in 2017 and 2018 and sowed about kind of tens of thousands of seeds each year and kind of with a seed mix of those 5 species. We also planted seedlings. We planted over 324 seedlings in 2017 and then 360 seedlings in 2018. And what we found was that from all of the seeds that we sowed, only 1 seedling germinated and established 2 years after when we broadcast seeded. Although luckily, or it was good to see that we had greater survival when we planted seedlings. So in 2017, we had over 15% survival of our seedlings. And then in 2018, we had about 2.8% survival. And so kind of lessons learned from this experiment was that we had greater plant establishment when using seedlings versus sowing seed. And we also did see greater survival of seedlings during the wetter, cooler year compared to the drier, hotter years. So it's an indication that annual precipitation probably plays a large role in seedling survival, unless you also decide to water your seedlings kind of during the first year after planting. So kind of lessons learned overall were that we needed to bring in seed to our sites, and also that if we are going to bring in plant material, seedlings are the way to go in Chaparral. The second constraint that was addressed was looking at the abiotic environment. So we tried 2 different things. We tried to increase soil microsites and soil heterogeneity for our seeds. And then we also looked at the canopy cover for our seedlings. And this was done at another site that I'll talk about in a second. So to manipulate the physical environment for seeds, we did some soil manipulation where we turned over the soil to increase the heterogeneity in some of our plots. And we were hoping that by creating some heterogeneity in the soil, that there would be a lot more little pockets for the seeds to kind of nestle down in and hopefully germinate. And then our other treatment was just no soil manipulation at all. And so the results that we saw from this experiment was that we really didn't see any difference in seed establishment from the plots that we manipulated and created heterogeneity versus those that we didn't. But it's really likely because we just didn't see any seed germination anywhere in any of our plots. However, we did see an increase in the native forbs from the seed bank in the plots that we turned over. And so lessons learned from this experiment were that perennial shrub species most likely require additional cues to initiate germination. And then I'll put a quick asterisk here and say that, so Robert, who planted annual species, did have success in germination. So it's likely just that the perennial shrub species are just a little bit more tricky and just need different cues to initiate germination. Sorry, I just saw this. Sorry, I just saw the chat. Hopefully everything is okay. I don't think I can see the chat without stopping the slides for right now.
No worries. It was yeah, irrelevant.
Okay, we can always get back to it if there are questions or other things that I can address. Okay, so this part where we also manipulated the abiotic environment for seedlings. So all of the research that I've talked about so far has taken place kind of in this grass-dominated landscape that's kind of to the forefront of the picture. But then across, there's another hill slope that is dominated by early successional shrubs, the main one being chaparral bush mallow, and then there's some grass in there as well. And so because we saw really low seedling survival kind of in our previous study, we wanted to see if we can increase their survival by planting these seedlings underneath established mature shrubs where it might be a little bit cooler, or there might be shadier, or maybe a little bit more moisture. And so here are just some images of the treatments that we implemented at this kind of shrub and grass dominated site. So to manipulate the canopy cover, we either did not remove any of the Malacothamnus individuals. So that was our most shady plot or shady treatment. We had other treatments where we removed half of the Malacothamnus individuals. And then our third treatment was where we removed all of the Malacothamnus. So this was our most sunny treatment that we had. And we focused on four chaparral species that are a little bit more woody and what we might expect to see in kind of a later successional community. So we focused on toyon, hairy leaf ceanothus, sugarbush, and also white sage. And in 2019, we planted 36 toyon, 36 sugarbush, 36 white sage, and 24 hairy leaf ceanothus within each of those three canopy treatments. And what we found was that the response was dependent on the species. So sugarbush had highest survival under the no removal treatments. Toyon and hairy leaf ceanothus had the greatest survival in treatments that had kind of a half canopy cover removal. And then white sage had the highest survival in plots where the Malacothamnus and the canopy were just completely removed. And so what we learned was that the responses and survival are species specific. And this, my guess is that it's likely due to the life history of each of these species. So whether the species is a sage scrub species or a chaparral species, or even whether it's an obligate cedar or resprouter. And so kind of overall lessons learned when we manipulated the abiotic environment is that we didn't see any additional seed germination when we created more microsites and heterogeneity in the soil. And then we also saw a species-specific response to our canopy cover manipulations. And then finally, looking at the biotic environment, we looked at both competition with non-native species and then also seed predation, which is an upcoming project. So to kind of address the competition from non-native species, we did a manipulation where we removed some of the non-native species. So again, we had three treatments. Kind of in the left side of that image, we have our no removal treatment where we didn't remove any of the non-native species. We just left them, whatever grew, we left. We also had a full removal treatment where we removed all of the non-native forbs and grasses. And then also our half removal treatment where we removed half of the non-native species from the plots. And so we would expect that in our no removal plots, there would be the most amount of competition from non-native species, and then in our full removal, the least amount of competition from non-native species. And what we found was that our full removal treatment had significantly, in our full removal treatment, significantly increased seedling survival. And so in these images, in the circles are the seedlings that we've planted that have survived. And there is a really large green plant in the middle of that left-hand picture. It is native, although it's not a shrub and it's not something that we planted. So it's good that natives are out there, but not necessarily the community that we were aiming to restore. And so lessons learned were that we do need to reduce competition of the non-native species to increase survival of our planted seedlings. And this is the project that is coming up that I'm quite excited about. So it was kind of built around that we didn't see any seed germination from the areas where we sowed seeds. So one explanation could be that maybe the sites didn't get enough water and rainfall was really low in some of the years that we seeded. It also could be that just insects and critters are removing all of our seed from our plots, or that they're eating the seeds. And so I've set up a number of 5 wildlife camera traps out at our site to see if rodents or birds, or if any of the seed predators are coming and eating our seeds. And so this is an image of a wildlife camera trap that is pointed at a Tupperware that's filled with seeds. And so what I'm hoping is that any time a bird or rodent comes and eats the seeds, that they will be captured on camera. And then I'll also be putting out pitfall traps to see if insects or other invertebrates are walking off with our seeds. And through both of these experiments, I'm hoping to learn, is seed predation occurring? And if it is, then who is eating or removing our seeds? And this could definitely help kind of shed some light on why we didn't see any germination in our earlier studies. And so for the biotic environment, it's definitely helpful to address competition from non-native species. And for seed predation, stay tuned, but hopefully through figuring out if there is seed predation, it might give us some insights as to the potential of restoring chaparral from seed. So this has been a summary of my work in the Veg Lab, but I'm only one person, and I only am showing you one body of work in our lab. And so with the rest of my time, I'd just like to introduce my colleagues and some of their work. So first, I'd like to introduce Shane DeWeese, who is focusing on restoration. Part of his research is focusing on restoration in chaparral and thinking about the topography and the microsites of where we plant species. So his research is focused on identifying landscape characteristics that result in greater sage scrub and chaparral seedling survival. And his goal is to increase the efficiency of chaparral restoration. And so this project that I'm showing you here, what he's done is he's planted thousands of seedlings kind of from the bottom to a top of a rather large hill. And he is collecting environmental data and topographic data at each of the sites where his seedlings are. And then he'll use the topographic information and the seedling survival to correlate together to try to find, predictable locations or predictable environmental conditions that are more likely to result in seedling survival. So I'll just say, so instead of, maybe restoring across an entire landscape, maybe we really focus on kind of smaller zones that are more likely to have successful restoration and successful seedling establishment. So next is Robert Fitch, who studies native species on fuel breaks. And so his research is focused on assembling native plant communities to revegetate fuel breaks with native herbaceous species, creating green breaks that limit the impacts of non-native species, reduce ignition potential, and support desired ecosystem functions. And his goal of his research is to promote native plant ecosystem services and meet fuel management objectives. And I really love this idea of creating green breaks and using native flowers and grasses to revegetate fuel breaks. So hopefully reducing the ignition risk while also allowing access onto the fuel breaks. Next, I'd like to introduce Maddie Nolan, who is studying grassland restoration and considering climate change, kind of in restoration and creating restoration plans. And so her research is focused on measuring the impacts of drought on community composition, and testing if locally seed is really the best way to restore considering climate change. And her overarching goal is to improve the establishment of native grasslands while increasing likelihood of their persistence in the future. And so what I really appreciate about Maddie's work is that she's asking the question of, how do we create resilient ecosystems into the future when we expect our conditions to get hotter and drier. So many restoration projects kind of focus on selecting seed from a local source, whether that's kind of immediate vicinity or watershed or county. And she is asking the question of, is it worth considering, choosing the same species, but just, species that have been collected from different counties. So for example, in Santa Barbara, if we expect to get hotter and drier, is it worth looking at seed populations from San Diego and using them to restore ecosystems here, or grassland ecosystems here? And then finally, Joanna Tong, who is studying vernal pools in urban landscapes. And so her research is focused on investigating the biotic and abiotic mechanisms and interactions that influence long-term native plant persistence in urban adjacent vernal pool ecosystems. And her overall research goal is to find new strategies to increase the long-term success and sustainability of restored ecosystems. So while many of us are focused on restoration in the wildlands or in the WUI, Joanna is focused on restoration in urban landscapes. And I think this is a really interesting kind of path forward, thinking about restoration, because it has the potential to create these native pockets within our neighborhoods and within the urban environment. And it also is a way to kind of maximize the community engagement with our native ecosystems. So that has been kind of the brief overview of my colleagues' research. And then I'll say, of course, it's also not just them doing this research alone, but they also have a number of collaborators that they are working with. So they've worked with practitioners, landowners, and homeowners that have also been interested in these questions. And so thinking about kind of just collaborations and working with the community, I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of us have pursued this career direction, because it allows us to collaborate with our community and kind of contribute our research and scientific skills to have a larger impact kind of beyond ourselves to help the health of our community and the biodiversity. And by collaborating with other organizations or with other people, it allows us to have a greater impact than we could alone, and also hopefully helps the other organizations meet their goals as well. And so thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciated the opportunity to share kind of my research and the research of others in my lab. And I'll say, even though we are all kind of focused on restoration right now, we're also very committed to the protection of these native California ecosystems. And so if you have any questions about either our research or just want to chat about California ecosystems, the ecosystems that we work in, please feel free to reach out to us. We're always happy to meet new people and new organizations and to chat about kind of these ecosystems that we all love. And then I'll also say that at least I know a few of us, Laura, Shane, and I, are either settled or settling in Santa Barbara and call it home. So please also feel free to reach out to us in the future. And so thank you so much for your time again, and I'm happy to take any questions and continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I guess I'll just make a plug while people are formulating any questions they may have. And just there's a lot of momentum really around the country, especially in California, to try to bridge the gap between research and practitioners. And so I just feel it's a great opportunity to have UC Santa Barbara here locally and have people like Stephanie and the people she introduced us today, Kevin, who one of our very own, that participates. But the more conversations that we could have about the issues that we face on the landscape that could help refine research, and then vice versa when they are coming up with nuanced approaches and ideas and things that haven't been discovered before. Having those relationships where the conversations are had helps inform us and keeps us better prepared, and we know where to focus our efforts as well. So really appreciate it, Stephanie, and it's one of the things that I think I appreciate about the Fire Safe Council, especially the Zoom. It makes it easy for people like Stephanie to come on and present. So thank you, and hopefully there's some questions from the audience.
Yeah, I would say just thanks, Nick, too. I mean, talking about kind of this collaboration, I mean, I think I thank you so much for introducing me to the group. Because I think, kind of seeing what the questions and what people are thinking about, what the practitioners are thinking about, can help us to, ask really important questions, because we want our research to be used and we want to be useful. And so kind of knowing what is important to practitioners is important to us, and then we can hopefully help make practices more efficient, and then we can kind of keep reiterating and work towards the same goals.
Stephanie, Jack, did you look at the soil erosion potential or the difference between grasses and chaparral on maintaining the soil stability?
That's a great question. We did not directly, we didn't look at kind of the erosion potential. We definitely experienced it when trying to plant and work and hike on these slopes, but didn't quantify it at all. But I say would be interesting, especially kind of the first couple of years after fire. I know that that's a big concern, kind of with denuded landscapes and grass. I think there are some models that can help with that, but we haven't looked at that directly.
I'll just
I
add.
want to commend you.
Go ahead.
It was a great presentation, and you got a good team you built. Looks like you got the capability of providing you some great information. So thank you very much, Stephanie.
Thank you. Nick.
I've got a question for Stephanie. Do you have any knowledge of anyone working on trying to get the non-native grass species away from the wildland urban interface area, and any work that's being done on species that would replace some of those grasses, such as Eriogonums or any of those species? And I'm wondering if you have any knowledge of any work in that area, because it's a great concern to us that live in that environment.
Yeah, I think that is a really great opportunity. So in our lab, Robert Fitch is looking at, is asking that question. So trying to figure out, are there native, forbs and grasses, so things that can, replace and kind of replace the non-native grasses, and, perennial species that also can, keep the live fuel moisture up. There's also someone at UC Riverside that I think is also looking at that same question. In terms of the in terms of the WUI and maybe not necessarily on fuel breaks, I know the project that I worked on with Nick, Nick is kind of did some research in that area. But I also think that it's a really great opportunity for future projects too, to think about, you know, not maybe in addition to the fuel breaks, but in that larger kind of WUI area, what can we do to kind of both, you know, maximize biodiversity, but then also, you know, maximize fire protection and the goals of keeping people safe.
All right, thank you very much.
And if I might piggyback on that question, in terms of having pockets in urban areas or even in the WUI that are more natural, you probably saw it, because I saw you were part of it, the zone 0, 1, 2. And what would be really helpful is a plant palette that homeowners could use that's both fire resistant and native and habitat value, so that we could plant in zone 1 or 2 natives instead of grass.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. That's actually one of the projects that Robert is working on as well. So figuring out, he's doing some experiments to see kind of what will germinate. So like, you know, what are good species to focus on? And then also kind of thinking about the plant traits, about how they might be able to keep out some of the grasses. And so he is working on a species list that he then would, you know, love for it to be disseminated and used by homeowners. So I think he's working on it currently, but hopefully, you know, in the next couple of years, there hopefully will be something that will address that question.
Share it with us and all the native plant nurseries. You know, people are going to them asking, and they don't necessarily have this this information. So that would be enormously helpful.
Yeah, I would love to share that. So I will definitely let Robert know, and we'll forward that on. And also the interest in having this species list. But thank you.
Stephanie, it's John. I got a question. You did a lot of your work down in Piru.
Mm-hmm.
Some of that open grass area, was that part of a fuel break, or was that a reburn with type conversion, or what was going on there?
Yeah, it was a type conversion. So the area that we're working in wasn't a fuel break. It wasn't cleared intentionally that we know of. So it was just repeat fires. And so kind of looking at some of the old photos, we could see that it was shrub dominated, and somewhere in the last 20 years went from shrub dominated to grass dominated. And so this area has had a number of fires. The most recent one was in 2003. And so probably a combination of fire, spread of invasive species, and maybe some of the drought too and climate.
Oh, thank you.
But conversion, yeah. Thanks, John.
I'd like to go back to Joan's question. I just want to remind everybody they got the Fire Safe Garden, which addresses many of those questions that she was asking, that you can refer residents to, but it shows them all the different options they have and how to plant chaparral and maintain a fire safe residency. So that's a great resource that's available to all of us. Maybe you're all aware of that, but we should continue to advise people.
Hey, Jack, you might mention where that's located so that people know.
It's the intersection of Stanwood and Mountain, right across from State Engine 7, Santa Barbara City. But it addresses many of those questions that you were asking.
Thanks. I wasn't aware of the fire safe garden, so I will definitely make a trip out there and take a look at it. Other questions?
There was a question in the chat.
In the chat.
Have you done long studies? You see it?
Yeah, so the question is, have you done long-term studies after planting seeds? Have invasive species overrun your plantings? In short, yes. So I have been out there since 2016. We planted and seeded in those first 2 years. And so long-term, I guess, for right now is, I guess, 5 years. So this year I'll be going out again and resurveying which species survived and which did not. But I can tell you from observations from being out there that it looks very similar to how it looked when we first went out there. And so, you know, I think there definitely is potential to restore, although I think it's challenging. And so that's part of kind of the long-term success is another reason why I also think it's going to be really important to also protect intact plant or chaparral stands, because just restoring it is challenging, and kind of addressing all of the challenges that non-native species present is also challenging. So in terms of, yeah, long-term we have, and we have looked at it, and yes, the invasive species come back. Okay, and then there are fire safe vegetation lists. I have that info on the EHIA website. Oh, fantastic, thank you. I'll also share those links and all of the resources with my lab mates as well, because I'm sure that they will love to know about all of these resources too.
Glenn Gazdecki had his hand raised as well. Glenn, you there? He may.
Glenn, I think you're muted still.
Oh, thank you. Sorry about that.
Thanks.
Thank you for your presentation. It was very insightful. And I want to get your thoughts and insights on something. I work for the Santa Barbara County Air Pollution Control District and serve as kind of the smoke management coordinator on prescribed burns. And obviously, chaparral and type conversion are a delicate balance and concern. In my understanding is that fire intensity, the time of the year that you burn, you know, wanting to avoid cool season when you burn, the thought being that the moisture in the soil would affect the roots and so forth. In the firing techniques, all play a role in trying to prevent type conversion. And so I'm trying to gain as much insight and understanding on how to prevent that and achieve a win-win. And so I want to, you know, open that conversation a little bit.
Yeah, I say thanks, Glenn, and I have a couple thoughts, but please let me know if there are other avenues to explore, because it's a big topic. So in terms of, you know, from my understanding, it's going to be really hard to reduce the fire frequency in Santa Barbara County, just due to the amount of ignition risk and people on the landscape and just activities going on. And so I don't know if we can, how much control we have over like changing the fire return interval. And then, you know, in terms of, I'll say, you know, drought and kind of future climate conditions, you know, I don't know if we can really change that kind of at a time scale that would be meaningful for us right now. And so some of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of kind of preventing additional type conversion, you know, might be kind of working at the edges of chaparral communities to maybe try to reduce the non-native species kind of at these edge areas, or, you know, increase biodiversity in stands that are starting to degrade, or where stands that are grasses are starting to kind of encroach in on. And I think that might be kind of, I've been curious about that as a way to think about kind of maintaining chaparral communities and reducing the presence of grass. I don't know, does that, it's a big question.
No, that's a good perspective. I appreciate that.
I would just add, you know, I think the biggest risk of type conversion is frequency of the fire, especially in chaparral. And we're lucky here in Santa Barbara County, unlike, you know, Riverside County and a lot of places further south, that, you know, given the nature of the forest and how many of it is landlocked, that we don't have the ignition risk that Angeles and San Bernardino and Cleveland National Forest have. just the nature of a lot of our ignitions being in areas where they could be easily accessed and suppressed more effectively. We don't have as much type conversion as you will see further south of here. But with that being said, at least from my perspective and my perspective when I was on the Los Padres, is that there are opportunities to do strategic landscape level prescribed fire in Chaparral to try to then, protect the overall landscape as a whole. So you may add a little bit more fire within a given landscape, but the theory, and if you're planning it, which most people are, it's to give an advantage if a fire were to escape, that it will then not transition into the larger watershed and cause type conversion at a much larger level.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, for bringing all of that up. Yeah, that's I say that too, where short interval fires or kind of a higher fire frequency definitely is a risk to type conversion. And as you were saying, it's like what are thinking about what are some of the levers we can pull, or how can we manage the landscape to maintain chaparral. I think it then becomes really kind of tricky, because if you to mimic what happens kind of historically or what happens in nature, it would be kind of during times when it's hot and dry, and then that's a huge risk. And so that's when kind of that's where the ecology and kind of land management meet to try to figure out what's the best. And it might be also like site specific. So considering topography or just what's going on at one area or one stand, kind of what's the best way forward for that might be different. And even as Nick was saying too, like different areas, different counties and different areas in Santa Barbara as well might require different things. Jack? Oh,
yeah. Go ahead. I was just going to say, Jack.
Hi, Stephanie. Good to see you. I'm really curious about the project that Robert's working on, and I feel like there's so much opportunity for invasion of invasives when there's clear and open space. And have you done any study or looked at the potential of including perennial grasses or lower growing forbs, native forbs in those in chaparral areas to sort of prevent there from being that vacuum which just loves to foster grasses?
Yeah. So Robert is definitely looking at that. And so he has, he has a big project coming up where, he is trying to figure out which species, focusing on those forbs, kind of the lower lying forbs and subshrubs and grasses that can be planted along the fuel breaks. And part of his research is looking at the traits of these native plants, and so kind of which native plants are best to match with the non-native species at the site to hopefully outcompete them. It's through resource acquisition or just shading them out. But kind of thinking about which species or species mix is best to kind of plant along these field breaks. To keep to try to keep the bare soil, to try to have a minimum amount of bare soil, and then also to keep the non-native grasses out. So he's definitely looking at that. And I'm happy I can share the species list or put you in touch with him too, if you're interested in more, but he's looking at that.
Yeah, I'd love that. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think we definitely see in some of the areas that we work a lot of grasses. When there's perennial grasses present underneath chaparral, they seem to resist invasion a lot better. So I'd love to hear some of that.
Yeah. I would say we see it work in theory in nature, and so it's just trying to figure out how we can create that in new places. So good to see you, Jack. Are there other questions?
Hey, this is Rob. Just a well, a couple of questions. First question would be, are you working at all, or is your group working at all with Lisa Stratton out at UCSB? I know she's done all the burning out on the Lagoon Island.
Oh,
Really, really
yeah.
intensive, long term project trying to use hot fire to kill off the non-native seed bed and then regenerate it with native forbs. And it's a super, super long-term, very labor-intensive project. And I've talked a lot with her about like, well, how do you translate this to large landscape? And she kind of laughs at me and says, yeah, that's not really feasible. So, but I mean, she's managing to do it, but it's just in these really small targeted plots of like a quarter acre a year where she stacks all this coyote brush onto the non-native grass, and then we go in and burn it, the county fire department, try to get it as hot as possible. And then it theoretically, while we're watching it happen, it kills off the non-native seed bed, and then she plants native forbs. But really, really labor intensive and be hard to replicate up on the field breaks. But yeah, the annual grasses are a pain in the butt for us wildland firefighters. So we kind of get the double-edged sword. If we don't have field breaks, we have a real tough time when we have 100-foot flame lengths coming at us. But then when we make field breaks, then we get ignitions and we get all those spin-off problems. So then the second comment, just a comment, not a question, more towards Glenn's question about prescribed fire. So it would be very rare that an agency would conduct prescribed fire operations in the same location where they would be coming, where the fire return interval would be conducive to type conversion. Typically, well, collectively in Santa Barbara County, the prescribed fire programs, both with the Forest Service and with county, are very small. I mean, it's just the amount of acreage that we burn is sort of a token. You know, it's just difficult to pull off prescribed fire these days. There's a lot of things going against you, weather and fire season and all that kind of stuff. We almost never would burn in the spring. That's just super rare. Maybe one or two small, tiny training burns that we would maybe conduct, but pretty much all the agencies in Southern California, if they're going to burn, it's in the fall. So it's always going to be dry and just because that's when we can kind of get the window to do it. But again, yeah, I would say prescribed fire's intention is not to type convert or to, create a super short fire return interval. Just the complexities of trying to get those projects done. We just don't even have the time and energy to even do that if we wanted to. Where I see type conversion, the small pockets of it in Santa Barbara County are pretty much near Forest Service recreation areas where there's significant numbers of fires over the year that overlap. So an example where there definitely is type conversion happening is in the San Ynez recreation area around all the campgrounds. Numerous fires that have come out of there, up in the upper Oso area, the area around White Rock, and that there's definitely type conversion happening. All of the large landscape fires, the Hasacita, the Whittier, they're all revegetating with natives, and we're not seeing a lot of invasives moving into them other than the field break areas or where we put in dozer lines. But just within the burn scars, I've walked them a lot, and they seem to be following the normal course of nature and, reverting back to chaparral for the most part.
Okay, I'll answer the question first. So thanks, Abio had asked about CBER. And so the students that are currently in Carla's lab we have great interest in the burns, but we haven't been directly involved with them. I know some of Carla's previous students have been more involved with the burns and kind of combining restoration or getting seeds out on the landscape, the burn. And I agree that source intensive and probably maybe best done on this, or more conducive to small scale restoration ones. which is also why I think maybe, you know, focusing on some of these urban areas might be more realistic, where we have a little bit more control. We can get trucks in, we can get personnel in. And then kind of tying to what you were talking about, where, yeah, like in a lot of these landscapes, because there's no non-native species dispersal into these sites, there's very little to no native species present. So it's just the native cycle and native species kind of coming back. But again, kind of thinking about, you know, where are the seeds? It's where people are, where people can like bring them in. And so kind of again thinking maybe you gave me a great idea, you know, but it's like, yeah, maybe we also focus not just in like urban areas, but kind of areas that are just closer to people, where the risk of ignition or where the presence of native grasses is kind of most prevalent. And that also helps with, you know, access to these sites and maintenance of them as well. Actually, Rob, can I ask a question real quick? So for the areas that you have burned, are there like site characteristics that make a site better or worse for a prescribed burn?
Well, we look at a whole lot of factors. I mean, one thing we look at is what are the smoke impacts going to be, because a lot of our areas that we could burn might be upwind of a community. So that can be problematic. We don't want to send a giant plume of smoke into, for example, the San Ynez Valley. So we do have to look at that. We look at fire return interval. We look at, is there any fire protection value to doing the prescribed fire? So just to go burn out in the middle of nowhere, you know, there needs to be a reason why we're doing it. And, you know, we have two different categories of prescribed fires that we engage in the county. Some of them are low-level prescribed burns that are happening in existing rangelands. So these are actually just your existing natural grasslands. Now, obviously, they're covered in non-native grasses, but there are thousands of acres of grassland that are currently agricultural parcels where there's existing grazing going on. So this is commercial agriculture grazing. So we assist certain groups in the county that are using prescribed fire for what they call range improvement. So again, the intent there is to make that landscape better for the grazing operations that are happening for either whether it's cattle or whatnot. The spinoff benefit for us is that we get a lighter fuel bed where fire suppression is a lot easier. It's just, frankly, it's way easier to fight a fire in grassland than it is in dense sagebrush. In other areas, we're doing prescribed fire just to reduce the fire return interval. So we look at the landscape, we go, when was the last time there was a fire there? And for example, if it's a sagebrush community, you know, we would look at fire return intervals that are exceeding 20 years in sagebrush. That's going to be an extremely decadent stand of sagebrush. You know, it'll be 90% dead. So that's where we would be looking at a place to do prescribed fire, not to type convert, but simply to burn off the old sagebrush, which then regenerates and makes a pretty almost totally fireproof landscape for about 5 years. You know, as that sagebrush is growing and it's really young, it pretty much isn't going to burn. And then you kind of get a benefit of reduced intensity fire for at least another 5 years. So basically for like 10 years, that landscape kind of provides a strategic block to fire. Chaparral, we don't do a whole lot of burning in continuous large stands of hard chaparral. We just don't. That would be, the forest agencies would be engaged in that, like the Los Padres National Forest, because they pretty much manage most of the landscape in Santa Barbara County that's dominated by the hard chaparral, like chamise and manzanese and things like that. Occasionally we'll have stands of that in some of our prescribed plots, but it's not the large landscape level acreages that you see in the Los Padres National Forest. So really for us, it's more burning sagebrush, grass, and understory under live oak. So we've done some burning underneath the live oak. And a lot of that is just because there's patches of live oak that sort of intermingle with the grasslands.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, really interesting. Thank you. Good to know. Are there Any other questions? Conversation topics?
I just out of curiosity have a question about the age of Chaparral, because there seems to be an age in which, yeah, it's best for fire prevention, as Rob just mentioned there. And I'm wondering if you've noticed a increase or decrease in biodiversity depending on the age of the chaparral. Like, I know once it gets to be 10 years old, it's pretty big and crowds out a lot. There tend to be, 3 or 4 different dominant species from what I observe, versus a younger chaparral that has a little more space around it. Do you notice that?
Yeah, I would say from the ecological side, I can kind of tell you what I'm familiar with. So yeah, so kind of species diversity is greatest in the year to fire, because you have kind of all of the shrub species that are germinating and small, but then you also have all of the fire followers and the annual species, kind of subshrubs, and kind of all of these species that are stimulated and cued by fire. But then you're right, like as time goes on, the shrubs will get bigger and start shading out the understory. There's thinning that happens as well, so you do end up with kind of a lower number of lower diversity, just because now it's gone from kind of a really diverse diverse community where you have the forbs and subshrubs and shrubs, to now a community that's just dominated by shrubs. But then I would say from what I know, and probably people in this room know a bit more about kind of the diversity and the number of species that are found in chaparral communities. From what I know, Santa Barbara is a little bit more diverse than down south in San Diego. But I will admit, a lot of the stands that I work in are grass dominated right now. And so if you're asking too about kind of like how many species would be expected, I would say it would be lower than kind of immediately after fire. But that's just kind of the natural cycle of chaparral, kind of natural succession in the community. That answer your question, or did you have another question?
No, that's great. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. If there are no further questions, we'd like to see you back again, maybe in a while, to see what's going on in your life and your studies.
Yeah, thank you. I would love to come back.
Sure.
And I'm so glad that I got to meet everyone here, see some familiar faces as well. So I would say thank you very much for your time. I can send Nick my ads, or you can have our contact info as well. And so we are definitely in town and kind of researching these things, and definitely happy to kind of talk more about it if there are questions that you have now or kind of that come up in the future. So thank you.
Thanks again. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Can you end the recording and then give hosting capability back, please? Outstanding. Thank you.
Okay. I think, Nick, you should be the host now.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate it, Stephanie.
Thanks. Feel free to reach out. We're definitely here. All right. Thank you.
That's the person.
Got a couple things.